I stood on the porch of the home my late husband built, a black garbage bag holding my entire life at my feet. Inside, the woman who had just buried my only son was already changing the locks. Sylvia thought she had won, but she hadn't seen his will. My name is Margaret Collins. I am 74 years old, and for 42 of those years, I lived at 415 Maplewood Drive. It is a sprawling, beautiful Victorian home nestled in the affluent suburbs of Connecticut, characterized by its wraparound porch, the ancient weeping willow in the front yard, and the rich, dark oak paneling that my late husband, Richard, restored with his own two hands. It was the house where I rocked my son, David, to sleep. It was the house where we celebrated every Thanksgiving, every triumph, and eventually, where I mourned Richard's passing. David was my light. After Richard died of pancreatic cancer 10 years ago, David became my anchor. He was a brilliant structural engineer, a man whose kindness was so vast it often bordered on naivety. He had my husband's striking blue eyes and my own soft-hearted temperament. We were incredibly close. Every Sunday, without fail, he would come over for pot roast, and we would sit on the porch, drinking iced tea and talking about his latest architectural projects. Then he met Sylvia. Sylvia Harrison was a gallery director in Manhattan, strikingly beautiful, with sharp cheekbones, immaculate blonde hair, and a wardrobe composed entirely of beige and black silk. She swept into David's life like a meticulously calculated hurricane. From the moment I met her, a cold knot formed in my stomach. Her smile never quite reached her eyes, and her compliments always felt like subtle assessments of my net worth. When David proposed to her after only 8 months of dating, I bit my tongue. I wanted him to be happy. I smiled through the extravagant wedding at the Plaza Hotel, paid for entirely from David's savings, as Sylvia's parents, a notoriously bankrupt pair of social climbers from Long Island, drank top-shelf champagne and boasted about their new son-in-law's income. 3 years into their marriage, David and Sylvia decided to move out of the city and start a family. They wanted a house in the suburbs. At the same time, I was struggling with the upkeep of Maplewood Drive on my fixed income. The property taxes were skyrocketing. David came to me with a proposition that seemed perfectly logical, perfectly loving at the time. "Mom," he had said, sitting at my kitchen table, his large hands enveloping mine, "Sylvia and I love this house. We want to raise our kids here. Let me take over the deed. I'll pay off the remaining mortgage, handle the taxes, and renovate the in-law suite in the back for you. You will live here forever, rent-free, with us. It keeps the house in the family, and it takes the burden off you." It was a beautiful plan. I transferred the deed to David. The in-law suite was renovated into a lovely, cozy apartment looking out over my prized rose garden. For the first few months, it was idyllic, but the children they planned for never came. Instead, Sylvia filled the house with expensive, cold modern art. She replaced Richard's antique oak furniture with sterile, sharp-edged glass and steel. And slowly, methodically, she began to freeze me out. The Sunday dinners stopped. If I came into the main kitchen, Sylvia would abruptly leave the room. She complained to David that my television was too loud, that my cooking smelled too strong, that I was suffocating their marriage. David, caught between the woman he loved and the mother who raised him, looked more exhausted with every passing month. I tried to make myself small. I stayed in my suite. I stopped walking through the main halls. I did everything I could to keep the peace for my son's sake. Then came the morning of October 12th. It was a Tuesday. I was in my garden pulling weeds when the ambulance screamed down our quiet street, tires screeching as it pulled into our driveway. I dropped my trowel and ran toward the main house, my arthritic knees protesting with every step. I found Sylvia standing in the hallway, clutching her silk robe, watching with a bizarre, detached calmness as 2 paramedics performed chest compressions on my son. David had suffered a massive, catastrophic cardiac arrest while tying his shoes for work. He was 46 years old. By the time we reached the hospital, he was gone. I collapsed onto the linoleum floor of the waiting room, letting out a sound I didn't know a human throat could make. The world fractured into a million jagged pieces. I had outlived my only child. There is no pain on this earth that compares to it. It is a reversal of the natural order, a cruel joke played by the universe. Through my blurry, tear-soaked vision, I looked up at Sylvia. She was sitting on a plastic chair. She was crying, yes, but she was already on her phone. I would find out later she was texting her brother, Gregory, a ruthless real estate flipper from Boston. My son's body was barely cold, and the vultures were already circling. The funeral was a blur of black fabric, the suffocating scent of lilies, and hollow condolences. Sylvia played the part of the tragic, beautiful widow to perfection. She leaned on the arm of her brother, weeping delicately into a lace handkerchief as they lowered my son into the earth next to his father. I stood off to the side, supported by my oldest friend, Beatrice Palmer. I felt like a ghost haunting my own life. I assumed, naively, that in our shared grief, Sylvia and I might find some common ground. I thought the loss of the man we both loved would bridge the bitter divide she had created. I was wrong. The dirt on David's grave hadn't even settled before the masks came off completely. 3 days after the funeral, I was sitting in my suite, staring blankly at a photograph of David as a boy playing Little League baseball. The door to my apartment swung open without a knock. Sylvia stood in the doorway, wearing a crisp white blouse and tailored trousers. She looked completely put together, rested even. Behind her stood Gregory, eyeing my crown molding with the predatory gaze of a man mentally calculating square footage. "Sylvia," I rasped, my voice hoarse from days of crying. "What is it? Do you need something?" She didn't step inside. She crossed her arms over her chest, her expression completely devoid of warmth. "Margaret, we need to have a practical conversation. I've been going over David's finances. Can this wait?" I whispered, fresh tears pricking my eyes. "Please, Sylvia? It's only been 3 days. No, it can't," she said sharply, her tone clipping my plea mid-air. "The fact is, David left me with a mountain of expenses. The upkeep on this estate is astronomical. I cannot afford to maintain it on my gallery salary alone. And frankly, I have no desire to live in a house filled with such morbid memories." My heart stuttered. "What are you saying?" Gregory stepped forward, pulling a tape measure from his belt. "She's selling the property, Margaret. The market in Connecticut is red hot right now. A developer will pay top dollar for a lot this size. They'll probably bulldoze the house and put up 2 McMansions. Bulldoze the house." The words hit me like physical blows. "You can't," I gasped, standing up so fast I swayed. "Sylvia, you can't. This is my home. Richard built the veranda. David grew up here. We have an agreement. David promised I could live in this suite for the rest of my life." Sylvia's lips curled into a patronizing smirk. "A verbal agreement, Margaret, which, legally speaking, means absolutely nothing. I've already spoken to my attorney. The deed is solely in David's name. As his surviving spouse, the property passes directly to me. You have no legal claim to this house." I felt the air evacuate my lungs. "Sylvia, please." I gave David the deed to help him. I have nowhere else to go. My pension barely covers my groceries and medications. "That is not my problem," she said, her voice dropping to a terrifyingly cold register. "You have never liked me, Margaret. You've hovered over my marriage like a dark cloud for years. I am done dealing with you. I am selling the house, and I need this suite empty so the stagers can come in." "Stagers?" I repeated, dumbfounded. "You have 48 hours, she stated, ignoring my shock. "Gregory will be back on Friday morning to change the locks. Anything left in this suite after 8 a.m. on Friday will be thrown into a dumpster." "You can't do this," I screamed, a sudden surge of adrenaline cutting through my grief. I am a 74-year-old woman. I am your husband's mother. You are throwing me out onto the street? You should have planned your retirement better, Sylvia sneered. She turned on her heel and walked away, the sharp click-clack of her expensive shoes echoing down the hardwood hallway. Gregory gave me a mock salute before following her, pulling the door shut behind him. I collapsed onto my sofa, sobbing until I threw up. The cruelty of it was unfathomable. I had lost my son, and now, in the exact same breath, I was being discarded like yesterday's trash. The next 48 hours were a nightmare of frantic packing and utter humiliation. I called Beatrice, weeping hysterically into the receiver. Beatrice, a fierce, retired schoolteacher with a heart of gold and a tiny two-bedroom apartment across town, immediately drove over in her beat-up Volvo, that wicked, soulless witch. Beatrice spat as she helped me shove my clothes, my photo albums, and my medication into garbage bags and cardboard boxes. Margaret, we need to call a lawyer. This can't be legal. She said the deed is in her name now. I wept, carefully wrapping Richard's ashes in a thick sweater. I signed it away. I trusted my son. I trusted him to protect me. David loved you, Beatrice insisted, taping a box shut with violent force. He never would have let this happen. That woman has poisoned everything. By Thursday evening, my beautiful suite was stripped bare. The spaces where my antique clock and embroidered armchairs had sat were just dusty outlines on the floor. Every memory, every shred of comfort I had known for 4 decades was packed into the trunk and back seat of Beatrice's car. As I walked out of the back door for the last time, it began to rain a cold, biting October drizzle. I looked up at the window of the master bedroom. Sylvia was standing there, holding a glass of red wine, watching me leave. She didn't wave. She didn't look away. She just watched as Beatrice helped me, a shaking, broken old woman, into the passenger seat of a cramped car. I had $34 in my checking account. I had a garbage bag, full of sweaters at my feet. I had no home, no son, and no future. As Beatrice drove us away from Maplewood Drive, the tires hissing against the wet asphalt, I pressed my face against the cold glass of the window and silently said goodbye to the only life I had ever known. But as I sat in Beatrice's tiny guest room that night, listening to the rain lash against the window pane, a small, stubborn ember ignited in the ashes of my heart. Sylvia had been so quick to execute her plan. Too quick. She was so blinded by her greed and her disdain for me that she assumed David was just as negligent with his paperwork as he was trusting in his marriage. She forgot that my son was an engineer. He was a man who calculated load-bearing walls and stress points. He planned for structural failures, and, as I would soon discover, he had planned for Sylvia too. The first 2 weeks at Beatrice's apartment were a masterclass in numb survival. Beatrice lived in a cramped, second-floor walk-up in a much older, significantly less glamorous part of town. The air in her building always smelled faintly of boiled cabbage, radiator dust, and lavender soap. I slept on a narrow twin bed in her sewing room, surrounded by stacks of quilting fabrics and plastic bins of yarn. Every morning, I woke up to the sound of traffic on the busy avenue below, a jarring contrast to the quiet rustle of the weeping willow back at Maplewood Drive. I spent my days sitting by Beatrice's window, wrapped in one of Richard's old cardigans, watching the strangers hurry down the sidewalk. I was a shell of a woman. I couldn't eat. Beatrice's hearty chicken stews tasted like ash. I barely spoke. I was entirely consumed by the twin agonies of mourning my son and the profound, humiliating loss of my home. My mind played a torturous loop of David's childhood, his gap-toothed smile when he learned to ride a bike, the proud tilt of his chin at his college graduation, followed immediately by the cold, calculating sneer on Sylvia's face as she ordered me out of my own house. I had tried to call David's usual family lawyer, a man named Thomas Wentworth, whom he and Sylvia had used to draft their initial paperwork when they got married. Wentworth's secretary brusquely informed me that as I was not the executor of the estate, they could not disclose any information to me. and that Sylvia was handling all affairs. It felt like the final nail in the coffin. Sylvia had won. She was going to sell the house, pocket the millions, and erase David and me from the earth. Then, on a dreary Tuesday morning, exactly 18 days after David's death, Beatrice's landline rang. Beatrice answered it, her brow furrowing as she listened. She held the receiver against her chest and looked at me, her eyes wide. "Margaret, it's a lawyer, but not Wentworth, a different one." My hands shook as I took the heavy plastic receiver. "Hello? This is Margaret Collins. Mrs. Collins, good morning. My name is Arthur Pendleton. I am a senior partner at Pendleton, Royce and Associates, over on Asylum Avenue in Hartford." A deep, gravelly voice said. It was a voice of absolute authority, the kind that did not rush and did not waver. "Please accept my deepest condolences on the passing of your son, David. He was a remarkable man and a highly valued client of ours." I frowned, confusion cutting through the fog in my brain. "Your client? I'm sorry, Mr. Pendleton, but David's lawyer is Thomas Wentworth. My daughter-in-law is already handling the estate with him." There was a dry, humorless chuckle on the other end of the line. "Mr. Wentworth handled David's marital paperwork. Mrs. Collins, I handle his private affairs. David retained my services privately 14 months ago to make substantial, overriding changes to his estate planning. I have the finalized, legally binding copy of his last will and testament, as well as several executed trust documents." My breath caught in my throat. I don't understand." "You don't need to understand right now, Mrs. Collins," Arthur Pendleton said gently. "You only need to be at my office tomorrow morning at 10 a.m. sharp for the formal reading. I have already sent a courier to notify your daughter-in-law. I strongly advise you to be present." When I hung up the phone, my knees gave out. Beatrice had to catch me before I hit the linoleum floor of her kitchen. David had a secret lawyer. He had changed his will. The next morning, Beatrice insisted on driving me to downtown Hartford. She forced me to wear my best black morning suit and pinned my hair up herself. "You are Margaret Collins," she told me fiercely in the rearview mirror as we navigated the morning traffic. "You built that house. You raised that boy. You walk in there with your head held high. No matter what happens." The offices of Pendleton, Royce, and Associates were intimidatingly opulent. Occupying the entire top floor of a glass skyscraper, the lobby boasted sweeping views of the Connecticut River, rich mahogany paneling, and thick Persian rugs that silenced our footsteps. As Beatrice and I entered the waiting area, my stomach violently plummeted. Sitting on a plush leather sofa across the room were Sylvia and her brother, Gregory. Sylvia was wearing a perfectly tailored charcoal grey designer suit, looking less like a grieving widow and more like a CEO preparing for a hostile takeover. Gregory sat beside her, bouncing his leg nervously, a leather briefcase resting on his lap. When Sylvia saw me, her perfectly manicured eyebrows shot up in genuine surprise, rapidly followed by deep irritation. "Margaret," Sylvia said, standing up and smoothing her skirt. "What on earth are you doing here?" "I was invited," I said, my voice remarkably steady despite the chaotic hammering of my heart. Sylvia scoffed, exchanging a look of pure exasperation with Gregory. "This is ridiculous. David obviously forgot to cancel some old, outdated policy with this firm. I already told Mr. Pendleton's assistant that Wentworth is handling probate. Whatever minuscule life insurance payout he left you, Margaret, we could have handled via mail. You dragging yourself all the way down here is just pathetic." "Watch your mouth, you vicious little viper," Beatrice snapped, stepping in front of me like a protective mother bear. Gregory stood up, puffing out his chest. "Hey, back off, old lady. My sister has been through enough without you two harassing her. We're just here to sign the release forms and shut this rogue file down so we can get back to the house sale." Before Beatrice could unleash the verbal thrashing I knew she was formulating, heavy double oak doors opened. A tall, distinguished man with silver hair and wire-rimmed glasses stood in the threshold. He wore a three-piece suit that probably cost more than Beatrice's car. Mrs. Harrison. Mrs. Collins, Arthur Pendleton said, his gaze sweeping over the four of us with sharp, analytical eyes. He did not look like a man who was about to hand over a minor insurance policy. He looked like an executioner holding a warrant. Please, step into the conference room. We have a great deal to discuss. The conference room was cavernous, dominated by a massive, polished mahogany table that seemed to stretch for miles. The sheer silence of the room was heavy, pressing against my eardrums. Arthur Pendleton took his seat at the head of the table, placing a thick, leather-bound folder in front of him. Beatrice sat on my left, gripping my hand under the table so tightly my knuckles ached. Sylvia and Gregory sat directly across from us. Sylvia looked bored, checking her gold Cartier watch with an exaggerated sigh. "Let us dispense with the pleasantries," Mr. Pendleton began, adjusting his glasses. "We are here for the reading of the last will and testament of David Richard Collins, dated exactly 14 months ago, superseding all prior wills, testaments, and marital agreements." "Superseding?" Sylvia interrupted, her voice losing a fraction of its bored drawl. "What do you mean, superseding? We drafted our wills together with Mr. Wentworth 3 years ago, and your husband privately revoked his portion of that joint planning, Mrs. Harrison, as was his legal right, Mr. Pendleton stated coldly. He opened the folder. David was an exceptionally meticulous man. As an engineer, he appreciated structure, contingencies, and, above all, recognizing when a foundation was failing. Mr. Pendleton pulled out a single sheet of heavy stock paper. Before we get to the division of assets, David insisted that I read this personal addendum aloud, in the presence of both his mother and his wife. Sylvia's face began to lose its color. She shot a panicked glance at Gregory. Mr. Pendleton cleared his throat and began to read my son's words. "To my mother, Margaret, and my wife, Sylvia, if this is being read, it means my heart finally gave out. The doctors warned me a year ago about my arterial disease, a fact I chose to keep private to avoid unnecessary worry and, frankly, to buy myself time to fix the mess my life had become. Mom, I love you more than words can express. You gave up everything for me. You handed over the deed to the only home you ever loved because you trusted me to protect you. For a long time, I thought I was doing just that, Sylvia. I loved you fiercely. But love is not blind. It is observant. 14 months ago, I was looking for our tax documents on your laptop and stumbled upon an open email chain between you and your brother, Gregory. I read them, all of them. Across the table, Gregory actually gasped, his face flushing a violent shade of crimson. Sylvia looked as though she had been struck by lightning. She sat perfectly rigid, her mouth slightly open, the arrogance completely drained from her features. Mr. Pendleton continued reading, his voice a steady, unyielding drumbeat. I read the emails detailing your plans to declare me incompetent if my health failed. I read your drafts with Gregory about how to legally evict my mother the moment you had full control of the property. I read the spreadsheets, the ones where you detailed how much money you were secretly siphoning from our joint accounts into Gregory's LLC, Horizon Equities, to fund his failing real estate flips under the guise of art acquisitions for your gallery. You thought I was just a naive engineer who only cared about blueprints. You forgot that my entire career is based on finding structural rot before the building collapses. You broke my heart, Sylvia, but I'll be damned if I let you break my mother. I was openly weeping now. Not tears of sorrow, but a profound, overwhelming wave of awe for my boy. Even with a failing heart, even while silently bearing the crushing weight of his wife's betrayal, David had stood between me and the wolves. "This is a forgery!" Sylvia shrieked, suddenly slamming her hands on the table. Her composure had entirely shattered. "This is a lie! That old bat wrote this. You can't prove any of those emails existed. We do not need to prove it, Mrs. Harrison, Mr. Pendleton replied, completely unbothered by her outburst. The emails were legally archived, but they are entirely irrelevant to probate. David did not need a reason to restructure his assets. He only needed the legal capacity to do so, which he had, in abundance. Please sit down, or I will have security remove you. And you can read the rest of this in the public record tomorrow. Sylvia sank back into her chair, trembling with a mixture of rage and terror. Now, Mr. Pendleton continued, turning to the formal legal documents. Let us move to the assets. First, regarding the property at 415 Maplewood Drive. My breath hitched. This was it. The house. 14 months ago, David transferred the deed of the property from his sole name into a blind, irrevocable trust. The Maplewood Legacy Trust, Mr. Pendleton explained. Because it is an irrevocable trust, it is not considered part of his personal estate and is immune to spousal claims in the state of Connecticut. Sylvia, you do not own the house. You never did. David merely allowed you to believe you did to prevent you from accelerating your plans. Sylvia let out a sound like a wounded animal. Who owns it? She hissed. The trust owns it, Mr. Pendleton said smoothly. And the sole, lifetime beneficiary of the trust is Margaret Collins. Mrs. Collins, the trust guarantees you exclusive, uninterrupted use of the entire property for the remainder of your natural life. Furthermore, David funded the trust with his primary life insurance policy $3 million, which is specifically earmarked to pay the property taxes, maintenance, and your living expenses for as long as you live. Beatrice let out a loud, triumphant cackle, clapping her hands together. I felt dizzy. $3 million. The house. It was all mine again. It was secure. What about me? Sylvia demanded, her voice cracking. I am his widow. He cannot leave me with nothing. The gallery is struggling. Gregory lost all that money on the Boston flips. Shut up, Sylvia! Gregory hissed, shrinking back into his chair as he realized his financial crimes were now essentially public knowledge in this room. Mr. Pendleton flipped a page. David was very clear regarding your inheritance. Mrs. Harrison, you are entitled to keep your personal effects, your vehicle, and the balances in your solely owned bank accounts. Furthermore, David left you a one-time cash severance of $50,000. Mr. Pendleton paused, looking over his glasses. However, there is a very strict in terrorem clause, a no-contest clause. If you attempt to challenge this will, contest the trust, or harass Mrs. Collins in any way, shape, or form, you forfeit that $50,000 entirely, and the estate will release the forensic accounting of your embezzlement to the district attorney for criminal prosecution. The silence that followed was absolute. Sylvia looked at me. The beautiful, cold woman who had stood in the window drinking wine while I was thrown out into the rain was gone. In her place was a broken, terrified fraud. Realizing the trap her brilliant husband had spent the last year meticulously building around her had just slammed shut. The silence in Arthur Pendleton's conference room was so profound it felt physical. It was the heavy, suffocating silence of a house of cards collapsing all at once. Gregory was the first to move. Without a single word of comfort to his sister, he violently shoved his chair back, grabbed his leather briefcase, and practically sprinted for the heavy oak doors. His frantic exit was a testament to his guilt. He knew that if the district attorney saw those forensic accounting files, he wouldn't just lose his real estate business, he would be facing federal prison time. Gregory! Wait! Sylvia cried out, her voice a desperate, pathetic squawk. But the heavy double doors had already swung shut behind him. He had abandoned her the second the money dried up. Sylvia slowly turned her gaze back to the mahogany table, her eyes wide, entirely devoid of the haughty arrogance she had worn like armor just an hour prior. She looked at Mr. Pendleton, who was calmly organizing his paperwork, completely indifferent to her panic. Then she looked at me. Margaret, she whispered. her voice trembling. It was the first time in years she had addressed me without a layer of condescension. Margaret, please. I have nowhere to go. The gallery's lease is up next month. The inventory is leveraged. You have to understand. I was just trying to secure my future. David was my husband. Beatrice scoffed, a sound like a starting pistol in the quiet room. You didn't want a husband, you greedy little vulture. You wanted an ATM, and when it broke down, you tried to steal the bank. Save your crocodile tears. I placed my hand gently over Beatrice's to quiet her, though I appreciated her fiercely protective rage. I looked at the woman who had tormented me, who had systematically tried to erase me from my own son's life, and who had thrown me out into the cold rain while my heart was still bleeding from grief. I searched myself for anger, expecting to find a roaring inferno. Instead, I found only a profound, icy pity. You had a future, Sylvia, I said softly, the steadiness of my own voice surprising me. You had a good man who loved you. You lived in a beautiful home. You had a family, but that wasn't enough for you. You traded a life of genuine warmth for cold ledgers and stolen money. David gave you exactly what you earned. I turned to Mr. Pendleton. When can I go home? Mr. Pendleton offered a rare, genuine smile, the crinkles around his eyes softening his severe features. He reached into his coat pocket and placed a heavy ring of brand-new, brass keys on the table, sliding them across the polished wood toward me. The trust has already paid a locksmith to secure the premises. Mrs. Collins. The old keys no longer work. 415 Maplewood Drive is legally yours to occupy as of this exact moment, Mr. Pendleton stated. He then looked over his wire-rimmed glasses at Sylvia. Mrs. Harrison, you are legally permitted to retrieve your personal belongings. The trust has graciously allowed a window of 48 hours for you to vacate the premises completely. If you or your brother are found on the property after 8 a.m. on Friday, you will be arrested for trespassing, and you will forfeit your $50,000 severance. The poetic justice of the deadline hung in the air. 48 hours. The exact same suffocating, humiliating time frame she had forced upon me. Sylvia opened her mouth to argue, to plead, but the cold reality of the in terrorem clause silenced her. She snapped her jaw shut, her face crumbling into a mask of bitter defeat. She stood up, her perfectly tailored suit suddenly looking much too large for her, and walked out of the room without another word. Beatrice drove me back to Maplewood Drive that very afternoon. The autumn sun was hanging low in the sky, casting long, golden shadows across the familiar manicured lawns of my neighborhood. As we pulled into the driveway, my breath hitched. The grand Victorian house stood exactly as it always had, the sweeping veranda welcoming me back, the ancient weeping willow rustling in the crisp October breeze. It felt like an old friend wrapping its arms around me. A large, white, moving truck was already parked haphazardly on the front lawn. As Beatrice and I stepped out of her beat-up Volvo, we watched as professional movers frantically hauled sleek, modern art pieces, mirrored dresses, and racks of designer clothing out of the front door. Sylvia was standing on the porch, furiously dictating orders to the movers while aggressively jabbing at her phone. She looked utterly frantic, the pristine facade entirely stripped away. When she saw me walking up the slate pathway, her posture stiffened. She glared at me, a look of pure, concentrated venom, but she said nothing. She couldn't afford to. Every word she spoke was a risk to the only scrap of money she had left. Beatrice and I didn't say a word to her either. We calmly walked past her, using my bright new brass key to unlock the heavy front door. Stepping back inside the foyer was a physical shock to my system. The scent of the house, a mixture of lemon polish, old wood, and the faint, lingering smell of David's favorite roasted coffee hit me like a tidal wave. I stood in the entryway, my hands covering my mouth, as the tears finally flowed. They were not tears of agonizing grief this time, but tears of immense relief, gratitude, and a heartbreaking pride in the son I had raised. David had known his heart was failing. He had carried the terrifying burden of his mortality alone, choosing to spend his final months meticulously drafting legal armor to protect me. He had analyzed the stress points of his marriage, identified the structural rot of Sylvia's betrayal, and built a fail-safe that no amount of greed could penetrate. He was an engineer until his very last breath. Over the next few weeks, the house slowly came back to life. With the generous monthly stipend from the trust, I hired a local crew to help me move my belongings out of the cramped in-law suite and back into the main house. The sterile, cold furniture Sylvia had purchased was gone. In its place, Beatrice and I scoured local antique shops, finding heavy oak tables and plush, comfortable armchairs that echoed the warmth Richard and I had originally built into this home. The in-law suite, rather than sitting empty, was repurposed. I transformed it into a small, sunlit studio for Beatrice, who had enthusiastically agreed to move in with me. The house was too large for one old woman, and after everything she had done for me, I wanted my dearest friend by my side. We filled the suite with her quilting fabrics and yarn, and the house once again echoed with laughter and the smell of hearty chicken stew. Every Sunday, without fail, Beatrice and I sit on the wraparound porch. We drink iced tea, even when the Connecticut air turns biting and cold, wrapping ourselves in thick wool cardigans. I look out over the rose garden, and I talk to David. I tell him about the books I am reading, about Beatrice's terrible driving, and about how the weeping willow is shedding its leaves for the winter. I miss my son with a fierce, burning intensity that will never truly fade. The grief is a heavy stone I carry in my pocket. Some days it weighs me down, but most days I just let my fingers trace its edges. But I am no longer a broken, discarded woman. I am safe. I am home. And I know with absolute certainty that even from beyond the veil, my beautiful, brilliant boy is still holding my hand, keeping the roof over my head exactly as he promised. The weeping willow still stands guard at Maplewood Drive. Sometimes I sit on the porch, feeling David's warm presence in every sturdy beam. He engineered my safety, building a fortress of love that greed could never dismantle. Sylvia vanished, a ghost of her own making. I am Margaret Collins, a mother who lost her whole world, only to realize her brilliant son had carefully built her a new, unbreakable one.